And actually, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
Because I know me. And yet,
So that's our life mission. That's the McShin's mission.
You don't have to understand my boundaries to respect them.
No, I'm the president, co-founder of McShin, a person in long-term recovery from substance use disorders.
How do you go about fixing the damage in the trust between the family after you get out?
Okay, I gotta work on that.
Celebrating my 6 months. Didn't have cake.
yeah.
Gosh, you showed up.
It's Layla. Welcome to Get in the Herd. Today we have a very special guest, the co-founder of McShin, Carol McDaid. Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm awesome. So
Thank
happy
you
you're here.
so much for inviting me today. And as Layla said, I am Carol McDaid. I'm a woman in long-term recovery, and for me, that means I've been alcohol and drug-free for 25 years. And my recovery has allowed me to become a wife, a mother, and now a grandmother, and a recovery advocate professionally in Washington, D.C. to fight for the rights of individuals with addiction and mental illness. So I'm really glad to be here today. I want to tell everybody a little bit, just a snapshot of my recovery story and how I got into recovery, and talk about how vital family, both our nuclear families that we were born into, the families that we create as adults, and then the family that we create of friends and allies that can be of support if our families are not in our lives. So let me just start with saying I got into addressing and facing my addiction in the middle of the night in 1989. It was close to the Christmas holidays. And my mother had had a stroke and was doing occupational therapy at a rehab facility, and they would have them do ceramics. And she made me a Santa Claus, a ceramic Santa Claus, and it was, maybe 9 inches high. And the place where I was living in D.C. was basically a trap house at this point. We didn't call them that way back then, but that's basically what it was. I was letting people use my apartment to either use or facilitate dealing. And this Santa Claus would sit there on what used to be a dining room table that was now, used by those that were sharing the apartment with me. And as I looked at that thing, I realized that I was in no shape or no appearance to go home for Christmas that year, which was a routine in my family that we all gathered back at home during the holidays. And it represented all the traits of what a normal life was, like that you have family and that you go home at Christmas and that you buy people gifts and that you're in a celebratory mood. And none of that was true for me because I was the kind of addict who was like smoking crack while she was in the shower and having to, drink straight vodka in the morning. I was a working addict. I still did go to work. But in order to get dressed and go to work, I would have to take several shots of vodka in order to get my hands to stop shaking enough to be able to put on my mascara. It was all about how I looked, of course. Even though, I looked terrible, but in my mind, I thought that I looked thin and svelte, and when in fact, all of the hems were coming out of my clothes. I had body odor because I showered infrequently. And I was just basically a hot mess. And so one night, in the middle of the night, that Santa Claus literally started talking to me. And it was reinforcing how dark and scary my life had become and how it was anything but normal and anything that included the love, light, and family connections that the holidays represented to me. And so I was obviously, trashed out of my mind, but I picked up the phone and called my sister at 2 or 3 in the morning and asked her if I could come over because I was afraid I was going to end my own life. And me and the Santa Claus got packed up into one of my bags and headed over to my sister's. And I was really a person that was not welcomed by most of my family by that point. And even with this sister, I had stolen her silver, I had crashed their cars, and my brother-in-law in particular was not fond of me at all. And I had earned that reputation. And it's one of the things that, we have to do when we first get into recovery is to face the truth to ourselves first of what we've done to those around us. And while we can't, make up for all of that right off the bat in early recovery, one thing we can do is to stop lying to ourselves about it and stop pointing fingers that everyone else caused all my problems. Many of us, so my sister was an integral role in, after she saw the shape I was in, because I'd been ducking her and avoiding her. All I was doing was going to work when I did, and then using, and that was the extent of my life. I literally lived like in a 4-block range in Washington, D.C., and stayed there and went nowhere else other than work and using. My sister saw the shape I was in, and she identified a place where I could go get help. She did all the work in doing that. My apartment was I was getting ready to be thrown out of it, but she did all the work. Well, I did go to a rehab out of state. She helped deal with all the logistics of that. There was an intervention where my family members and my boss and other friends of mine all gathered around, and this was in the old day when they were like surprise attacks. And I went into my favorite bar that I kind of frequented sort of every night on the way home from work. And there in the far back, I could see 2 suitcases and my sweet little mother from North Carolina and some other people and my boss sitting in the back of this bar. And being a good addict, I knew this was no good could come of having my boss and my mother in the same room, like the jig was going to be up. So I just turned around and hightailed it out of there. And they had hired an interventionist who came chasing, down Connecticut Avenue after me to bring me back. And so I really, my boss told me that I either went to rehab or I lost my job. And I knew at that point, because we're quick on our feet people, right? I had stolen, I wasn't sure how much, but I knew I'd stolen a lot of money from our petty cash system, because I had a job that had me going outside and going up to Capitol Hill because I'm a lobbyist. And so I had, reasons to be taking cab rides and meals and stuff like that, but I was bilking it wildly for expenses that I had not incurred. And I knew that if I went away, it was all going to and I stopped turning in phony receipts, the whole escapade was going to be discovered. And this was a multinational accounting firm, and I knew they were not going to take too well to having their accounting system, beat by one of their employees. So I said, at that point, the only thing that kept me from admitting that I was no different than the homeless addict on the street was this job. And it was, it was a pretty good job, and it was uniquely designed to someone who was an addict, because there was a lot of entertaining and so-called partying involved, and I was really good at that. And I was really good at I was manipulative, and I could get information that other people could use in business from people when I had them, drinking and using with me. And so I went to this rehab thinking that I'll just get everyone off my back, and I'll go and I'll keep my job, and I'll come back and it'll be business as usual. And when I got back, there was a few days in between when I could get into a recovery house, mostly in D.C. At that point, there were Oxford houses, and that was where I was going to live. But there was no bed available. And this was like right after Thanksgiving that I got home. And so I had to go back to this sister's house where I was definitely unwelcome, at least by her husband. Her kids loved me, and she loved me, but nobody loved who I had become and what I did while I was in active addiction. But she put up with the, I'm sure the massive fighting that went on with her husband to have me back in their home. And at that point, that started my process of regaining trust with people in my family. And probably like many of you listening, we had a history of drug and alcohol addiction in my family on both sides. I was raised Irish Catholic. I am Irish and was raised Catholic. And we had, many of you understand that certain demographics of people are more subject to getting the disease of addiction and having it, the full extent of it triggered. And Irish people are one of those, as well as, Native American, Alaska Natives, and there are other groups, people who have low socioeconomic status are oftentimes, because of what they're exposed to, trauma and other things, have a higher propensity towards getting the disease of addiction and having it triggered. So, it was at that point that I had to start this sort of brand new process of being in recovery. I was very shaky about it. And having my brother-in-law sit there and call me names and reinforce all the shitty things that I had done to them was not making that process any easier, as you can imagine. But I had nowhere else to go. And I had to face the fact that you have really nowhere to go. This house is the only thing that's standing between you and homelessness. And I knew if I didn't have stable housing, I was going to use again. It wasn't at all clear to me I wasn't going to use again anyways, but I was literally taking it a minute at a time. My job did take me back against the advice of many of the people in the treatment industry and other professionals who were involved in my care. They thought there's no way that anyone can go back and be involved with all the parties and fundraisers and stuff that are around the government relations business. Sort of like sales, and I was bound and determined that I was not going to quit this. And so I saw the steps on the wall for the 12 steps, and I am in a self-help program. There's many pathways to recovery, but that's the one that I have chosen for myself. And for me, I learned the hard way from relapses that total abstinence was going to have to be the pathway for me. I don't judge other people who have a different pathway than mine, but that is the one, through tried and true and hard-lived experience, I've learned that it has got to be with me, because I cannot use any mind or mood-altering chemicals in any amount without going completely off the deep end. It's like many of us, we break out in handcuffs if we start using anything. And at first it can be very tricky, because at first you can have a couple beers or something and not have these great consequences. But if you're an addict like I'm an addict, and I call myself that intentionally, just a shorthand for the term an individual substance use disorder, because we are not our illness, right? We are people, we're humans, and we have a condition that when we are in the active phase of it, we do really dumb things sometimes, right? We rob, we steal, we lie, we cheat, we're uncaring. But that does not mean that those things you do while you're in active addiction are who you are. You are a loving child of God, no matter what. The behaviors that you do when you're active in your illness are not who you are. They're what you do when you're actively using. And I think it's important that we get that straight for ourselves, because if we don't understand that ourselves, we allow other people to treat us like dogs. And that's not something that, you can necessarily take on the second you enter recovery. But over time, you learn to create healthy and loving boundaries with people and not allow them to name, call, or shame you. So my point about talking about the importance of family is because one of the most important things that I can say about my experience with the disease of addiction is that we cannot recover alone. And that does not necessarily mean that you have to recover in the confines of the watchful eyes of your family, but it does mean that if you don't have good relationships with your family, and I would argue that those can be regained in most cases, you have to create your own family, a group of people that love and you, support you, understand the journey you're on as you re-enter the community. I know many of you may be listening to this and you're involved with the criminal justice system. And I want to say that for you, it's the same as anyone else. When you first get out, it's tough sledding. if you have a high risk of relapse, and you have a higher risk of death than people who don't, because you've been on the inside. And hopefully most of you presumably are abstaining from alcohol and drugs while you're on the inside, but that puts you at high risk of relapse and overdose and death if you're using opioids like fentanyl when you first get out, because you can't go back and use what you were using before you came in without a serious risk of harm of a fatal or non-fatal overdose. And so these emotional issues, like shame you may have for mistreating your family, can trigger addicts, and it has to be done carefully, gently, and over time. It definitely can't be rushed. I know many of you with kids may feel this incredible longing that you must get back with them and you must fix the wrongs or the neglect perhaps that went on while you were using. And my biggest caution to people is to proceed carefully and slowly at the beginning. And anytime you fly in an airplane, they always tell you to put your if there's in case of an emergency, to take the oxygen mask and put it on yourself first, and then put it on your children or loved ones that are sitting near you. And that is the same advice for people in recovery. We cannot go back and start trying to rebuild every aspect of our life all at once. At first, you have to focus on your recovery and what you need to do to sustain that, and how you have to get across to yourself that this is your responsibility. How you manage your recovery, yes, you can get support from either loved ones or the family you create yourself of support around you, but we don't do it alone. It is not, the opposite of addiction is connection. And so however you get your support, you've got to have it. And if you don't know how to do that, I think that's why many of us, again, who follow a 12-step pathway, get what's called a sponsor or someone that can help you guide yourself in your recovery. And so for me, I was so heavily relying on this sister at first. I just kept thanking her and thanking her and thanking her and thanking her, because she went through a lot. She had to pack up my apartment. She had 2 kids that were in diapers at the time and trying to hide her wasted sister upstairs in some bedroom. And I had been the kind of aunt. I have a wonderful daughter who's her bonus mom, but I didn't have children of my own. And I was the kind of aunt that would promise you a pony for your birthday and then not even show up. Like, I had a lot of ground to rebuild and recover. And thankfully they were young, but they remember some of my just erratic and irresponsible behavior as an aunt. And I have, through the guidance of a sponsor, gone through the process of living amends to them. But I also had to deal with my mother and father, and they both had been involved in one way or the other with active addiction. My father being the worst, and he was sort of like, if you've grown up in an alcoholic or addicted family, if there's one parent that seems to be the worst, it's like the whole family dynamic is designed around this one individual that was using. And that was certainly the case with me, with my father. And he was abusive to us, physically, sexually, emotionally. And it was always an excuse I would use. Well, you'd use drugs like me too if you'd been through what I'd been through. Like, oh, woe is me. Like, oh, I have all these problems, and this was my excuse to use. And my mother neglected me, and, all of these different things. They may or may not be true as part of your experience, and they were true as part of mine, and I've had to face them for what they are. But what we cannot let ourselves do is to blame our families for our current situation and somehow shift the responsibility from our responsibility to somehow that they or them or those people are responsible for causing this. Because what that says to yourself when you say that to yourself over and over is that somehow you're shirking your own responsibility for creating the kind of life you want and your own happiness. Nobody else from your past can create the kind of life you want to lead and how happy you are. You have to do that for yourself and decide that, yes, these things happen to me, but they are not a dictate of the way my entire life is going to be. That these things are part of my past, and they may inform some of the ways we behave currently, but they don't dictate who we are, and that we're absolutely going to have to turn out like they did, or any of that kind of stuff. It's not true. Intergenerational addiction can be broken, and I'm living proof of it. So one of the other ways I had to work with my family is to come up with a relationship of how I was going to interact with some of the people in my household that were still abusive or still using. And that took some adjustment and getting used to. And I think one of the most important things I had to do was not judge them for where they are. Like, a lot had transpired during that whole time while I was using. And a lot of it was totally unbeknownst to me, because the only thing I could do was focus on myself and how to get the next one. So people go through stuff. They get sick, they have illnesses, they have job loss, they have losses and heartbreaks, just like all of us do. And a lot of us were totally tuned out to that because we were so busy using. And so, if you come back home and you've got this new way of life you're working on, it doesn't mean everybody else has to change their life to accommodate your new one. And I had to learn that if I was going to be uncomfortable around people drinking alcohol in front of me, that I had the wrong family. Like, people in my family do drink, and not all of them drink, abusively. And so I had to figure out when and how much of that I could take. And early on, it was pretty limited. And in fact, with my father, I had to go a good chunk of time without re-engaging with him, because his addiction was doing push-ups while I was working on mine, and he was really pretty bad off, and I couldn't be around it. And so, I had different strategies for different family members, is what I'm trying to get across. But the first principle was non-judgment of where they were, regardless of what had happened, because at some point you have to make amends and make peace with yourself and the childhood you went through, so that you can go on and create a happy life for yourself. And so that was important for me to learn. I had to have individual strategies for individual family members, and I had to have strategies with people at work. Like, I was the type of employee at work that everyone knew that I was using, and I was life of the party girl. And so when I suddenly disappeared for a month, it didn't take a rocket science to figure out that I had been sent off to rehab. And people had a million questions for me, as you can imagine, when I got back. How was it? Can I take you out for a beer to celebrate? Like, people say and do crazy stuff, right? And we don't judge them for it, but it's where they are. They don't know a lot, and we definitely teach people how to treat us. So I had to take out an insurance policy on my recovery and say, no, I don't drink anymore at all. And after I would see the look of shock past their face, I would say, yeah, none, not at all, not today, and hopefully not ever. And people who so associated me with this Irish party girl had a hard time adjusting to the new me. And I had to, and there were some awkward moments, where other people that I had to figure out who were really my friends at work and who were just my using buddies. And so that was a process. And again, you have to be pretty forgiving with people. They don't know what they don't know. And again, it's your responsibility to manage your recovery. And oftentimes people who use addictively themselves, they feel like they've lost an arm when you tell them you can't use with them anymore. And we have to be patient and understanding with what that means to them, while still managing our own recovery and what we need to do. I think, the other thing that I had to do was to manage the amount of time I spent with certain people in my family. And so my mother and I had excellent time spent together, going to lunch and shopping. But sitting around with idle time, not so much, because my mother would start on this kind of rant about how she didn't cause my addiction. It wasn't her fault. She's so ashamed, and all that kind of thing. And by the way, when are you going to get married and have kids? And so there was a lot of pressure on me about that. And so what I did with my mother, we went to the movies together, we went shopping, and we went to lunch. And when I was home, I watched Oprah with her, and that was it. We did not just have idle times. chatting, because it would always go back to her to try to unblame herself, if you will, for my addiction, and that it constantly just allowed it to get under my skin. And so I didn't want to be abusive to this woman who just had a stroke and was really struggling herself. So I just limited the time to times that I knew could be that was spent well with her. And, I think the other thing, besides improving relationships with families, I had to learn how to change my relationship with what is fun, right? Because fun for a while when I was early in my addiction, fun was going out, going to clubs, doing X, dancing. There was this special band that I followed around the country called the Grateful Dead. Like, that was fun early in my recovery. I know, you look at me now and you think, she's a deadhead? Well, yeah, she was. And kind of once a deadhead, always a deadhead, I guess I'll say. I just don't tour chasing after Jerry anymore. But all those things all involved drug use, number one, and all involved the environments where my strange behavior behind using was accepted. And like many of us, as my addiction progressed, my behavior became more and more unpredictable. Like, I was that girl, I could be the life of the party one night and then sobbing in the corner the next. And then the third night, grabbing your car keys, going out for a joyride in your vehicle to go get more alcohol with no one's permission. And it's like, people almost, when we went to big, events or traveled together, like, okay, you know how now we have designated drivers. People used to have to designate someone to keep an eye on McDaid, like, because she was just like do any old thing and get everybody else arrested. So later on, I had to relearn what fun looked like for me. And I think, I, like many of us in early recovery, was like, oh, God, this is going to be a nightmare. Like, you can't drink, you can't use. What in the hell am I going to do with my time? And if you hear nothing else that I say on this podcast, hear this. I have more fun times in recovery than I've ever had using. And I mean that. And that's with having, traveled the world and done all kinds of crazy things and gone backstage at concerts and all kinds of stuff, which when I was young, I would classify as exceptionally, awesome times. But I've had so much fun for recovery, number one, because I'm truly connecting with people while I'm doing it. And number two, I'm present for it. I can actually remember it. I used to have to get up after doing these big, exciting things when I was using, and I'd have to ask my friends, what did I say? What did I do? Where did we go? And the first thing I'd do is go out and look and see if I'd crashed my car or anyone else's, because I had this weird obsession with driving and using. And so fun for me looks like now, I love to entertain at my house. We have big parties. At Christmas, we have a big party at our house for around 300 people, sometimes less or more, but a big party and it's for everyone. It's for people in recovery. It's for neighbors, friends, family, the parents of people or family members of people who are in recovery, our participants that are at McShin. We just have everyone, and it's truly an open house to celebrate what the real meaning of that season is. And every year at that party, I think about that Santa Claus that my mother had sent me, and how what a life-changing moment that was, having that uncomfortability with looking at that ceramic doll that she had made me, and how that was really the start of a whole new way of life for me. The other things I do for fun today, I go out with, I've got this girl posse of amazing people that I've met in the fellowship, that some of them I sponsor, some of them I don't, but that we're all that family of our own making that I talked about. If your nuclear family is not something that's an option for you now, you can make your own friends inside that are like-minded. You can make your own friends on the outside that are like-minded and share my interest. I have girlfriends who are not in recovery, but the ones that I have in recovery are the ones that I can be the realest with, and that frankly can be real with me when I need to be called out on something I'm doing. Or some sort of, omission I'm making, or lying about how I'm feeling or doing or whatever, they'll go, "Come on, see that look on your face, McDaid. Come on, like you're not okay. What's going on?" And they'll push me on that and hold me accountable to sharing what I'm feeling. My husband and I and our family, we take great trips and vacations. We have a new grandchild, and we were able to spend a week at the beach all together, enjoying my new grandchild and our time together. I've learned, my daughter's married, and I've learned to fold in new family members into the picture and work on relationships there and improve those. And
Can I ask you a quick question in regards to John?
yeah,
So John Shinholzer, for those of you who don't know, is the president, and also Carol and John, they co-founded McShin. So relationships is kind of a hot topic for anyone, and then relationships and recovery is a even hotter topic, I guess. It's like, how have you maintained a healthy relationship while still prioritizing your recovery?
that's a great question, Art. Thanks for asking it. I think I wouldn't say, sometimes I'll have to say in this area to do as I say and not as I did. I did have a relapse, as I mentioned to you, and during that relapse, I met John. And John ultimately helped me get back into recovery, and ultimately, we ended up getting married. And I wouldn't necessarily, I made sure I had a year clean before I got married. I probably could have used some more time on that in hindsight. But I think that, our shared passion for recovery creates this special bond. Before we started McShin, we used to have people in or seeking recovery at our home. And so every sofa would have like a little mini dop kit of toiletries and stuff for people. We had people literally on every couch in our house. And I had been very active in the DC recovery community. He had always been active in the Richmond recovery community. And it felt creepy to me that I'm off passing all these laws and doing great things for people in recovery nationally, but in my own backyard, I wasn't doing anything. And so we both agreed that it made sense. We had long waiting lists at those times for public sector treatment slots, and maybe 25 or 30 days in some cases at the community service boards in our area. And so that's why we started taking people into our home. And eventually, as you can imagine, it got to be, our daughter was growing older, and it got to be too hectic to have everyone in our house. But I think our shared passion for recovery, bringing recovery principles into the relationship is key. Love, mutual respect, compassion, understanding that your spouse has triggers just like you do. They might be different ones, but you have to learn that they have them and do what you can not to trigger people. We both had traumatic childhoods, and it's easy to trigger those kind of experiences. Like I remember whenever I disagreed with John on something when we first got married, he would take that as a personal affront, not as just two adults having different opinions on something. It was like I was criticizing him personally if I didn't agree with him. So we had to learn how to negotiate. I didn't get married till I was 39. So I already had a full and complete self that I was bringing to the marriage, and he had been married previously, and he had a full and complete self. So we had a lot of learning on how to build mutual respect, and learning not to be the only ones that he had his daughter, of course, but both of us were adults who were kind of running our own shows and doing our own things, and we had to learn, how do we bring this together? How do we mutually agree on, okay, this is his, hers, and family activities? And some of those things, I think, are the ways that we've kept our relationship. And I think over the years, one of the things that's been, incredibly important is to share the incredible respect I have for the work he does with him. I'm great at bragging about John behind his back, but I'm sometimes not great, and I will defend him like a mama bear. But sometimes I don't do as good enough job to praise him to his face about who he is, about what he does. And the other thing is, John is one of the most honorable men I know. And I know he can be brusque and he can be brawny and salty with his language and stuff, but inside that man has a heart of gold. And I trust him implicitly, which was something that I did not have with previous.
Yeah, trust is huge.
Huge,
Yeah.
huge. And I trust him implicitly, and I think he does with me. You know, one of the things I'm really proud of is I have never picked up my husband's phone and looked at it. Never. I've never gone on his computer. And I have some debates with some of my girlfriends about this. I'm a big believer that trust is demonstrated by action. And if you really trust your partner, you don't go and look through all their stuff. Some of my girlfriends disagree with me, but that's okay. We can agree to disagree on that. But trust is key, compassion is key, love is key. And I think, having intentional date nights has been really important for us too. And we have to take turns planning them because, otherwise John would go to the same restaurant that's around the corner from the house, So we have to, let's get in and get out, And so, and having a sense of humor is also incredibly important, especially when you're mad. But I do have a husband that's very outspoken. And I remember at first, especially when I was early in recovery, I had to learn how to have my own voice. And we had to go to marriage counseling, of course. But I would do the time out sign a lot. And that was one of my nonverbal ways of communicating with him is like, dial it back, don't raise your voice, and give me a minute. And that has worked for us. I do it to this day when I need it. I need to do it a lot less, but when I need to, I'll still do it. Or even I'll just take my fingers like it's a dial. Like if he's raising his voice with others around and he doesn't know it, I just turn the dial. I do the finger motion of turning a dial back.
You doing that to John.
Well, if any of you have ever been in my house or seen us at dinner, you might notice that I'll do this, and it's just because he's hard of hearing. He sometimes yells, and it's very intimidating.
I got you,
Yeah. So, anyways, that's my relationship tips, I think.
I like that. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story.
Did you want to share anything else? We're maybe like another 5 minutes. You have anything you want to close out with?
I guess what I would say is that recovery is a journey. Give yourself a break. Give yourself time. Recovery does take time. And ask questions. There is more content about how you can recover now than there has been historically ever. There's tons of podcasts like these. There's documentaries. There's movies. And then there's people like me who are more than happy to answer people's individual questions. And I guess the final thing I would say is if you had told me when I was using that I was going to be a lobbyist for like Hazelden and the Betty Ford Center, I would have told you had lost your mind. Recovery not only gave me my life back, but it gave me a sense of purpose and passion, and I've been able to turn my biggest lemons into lemonade by using my experience as a recovering addict to help inform the way that I advocate for other people with this disease, which is really one of the greatest honors that I can think of. So thanks so much. I'm delighted to have been included today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carol.
Awesome.
Appreciate you guys doing the podcast. Thanks for listening, everyone.